Welcome back to Grade History, Unit Number 2, Canada's Changing Society, 1890 to 1914. This is Lesson number 22. How did different groups respond to racism and discrimination? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Can you think of a time when you were treated unfairly or misjudged by someone who didn't know who you were? How did you respond to this unfair treatment? We will be talking about these two questions in our next class. So when I'm finished speaking, please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to these two questions. And let's begin. Many people in Canada, both today and in the past, have faced racism and discrimination in different forms. Today's lesson will look at how different groups responded to racism and discrimination in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In both rural and urban areas, black people were often denied the same opportunities that Caucasian people had. In areas with large populations, black children were made to attend segregated, that means purposely separated schools. Black families in rural areas were given poor farmland and or paid much lower wages for their work. In cities, black people were often refused service in restaurants, forced to sit in a certain section on the bus or in a theater, and were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. Also, black people were not allowed to join organizations that were formed by Caucasian people, such as unions, social clubs, and sports leagues. And so that's why up until the 1950s, you saw the formation of separate leagues for black people. And then over the course of the 40s and 50s, a number of different athletes would be brave enough to break what has been referred to as the color barrier. At the end of the 1800s, the federal government-owned Intercontinental Railway, or ICR, hired many black men as porters or servants. Black porters often worked on first-class passenger cars. However, they were paid lower wages and worked longer hours than Caucasian porters. Porters were often allowed only 3 hours of sleep each night and faced bad treatment from the passengers. And this photo from the 1890s shows a black porter standing behind Caucasian first-class passengers. My question for you is, what elements of this photo show the passenger's social status? When I finish talking, please put the video on pause so that you can take a closer look at this picture and then write down your response to this question. Okay, let's continue. Despite these harsh working conditions, black porters were not allowed to join railway worker unions that could have protected them. When there was a slowdown in railway business in 1898, the company decided to fire its black porters. This was done to avoid violence or strikes from the unionized Caucasian porters. It would also create more jobs for Caucasian porters. Members of black churches were outraged. They contacted newspapers and politicians to make the discrimination public. The church leaders told Laurier's Liberal government that if it did not help the black porters, then there would be enough voters in the black community to help elect the Conservatives. For weeks after the firings, newspapers accused the Liberals of racism for their lack of supports. In the end, only some black porters were rehired. Eventually, the black porters organized their own union. The gentleman you see in this photograph is the Reverend Doctor J. Francis Robinson. He was an African American minister working in Halifax, and he called for labor unions to protect the rights of the black porters. In the late 1800s, Growing anti-Chinese feelings in Canada had led to government bans on hiring Chinese workers. In response, Chinese people started their own businesses. In Vancouver, these businesses were located in the city's poorest neighborhood. Housing in Vancouver's Chinatown was overcrowded, and sanitation was poor. Chinese people and their businesses soon became identified with health problems. In order to survive, benevolent associations, or charitable organizations, were set up to provide basic services that the government failed to provide to the Chinese community. By 1910, these associations had set up schools and hospitals and provided assistance to newcomers and job seekers. They also offered legal support, and they helped the Chinese community to force governments to change discriminatory laws. The Chinese youth living in Canada were very aware of the racism and discrimination their community faced. Growing up in Canada, young Chinese people spoke the language and understood their parents' culture. They were also able to speak English and adapt to the Anglo-Canadian culture, since many went to English-speaking schools. In 1914, a group of young Chinese men in Victoria, BC, founded the Chinese Canadian Club. Since Chinese youth were excluded from taking part in social clubs run by Caucasians, the Chinese Canadian Club provided its own activities and cultural events, such as sports and book clubs. And looking at the clothing worn in this photo, what message do you think these men and women were trying to convey about the Chinese community? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. And let's continue. Canada's economy started to improve in the early 1900s. Though the federal government preferred British and Northern European immigrants, it needed temporary workers to help build the country. As a result, thousands of Southern European men, including Greeks and Italians, answered the call for cheap labor. Thousands of young Italian men hoped for good jobs and better opportunities in Canada. They were given temporary jobs in the railway, mining, shipping, and lumber industries. Since the jobs were seasonal, the men were not guaranteed work for the whole year, and they were often treated poorly on the job. Look at this picture here. What can you infer about the working conditions of this job based on the details that you see in the picture? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. And moving on. The Italian workers could not stand the dirty and dangerous jobs. Their relationships with their employers grew very tense, to the point that there were strikes by dock and freight workers almost every year between 1902 and 1912. The striking workers, who were mostly Italian, sometimes expressed their frustration with violence. The newspapers focused on this violence instead of considering the reasons why. Instead of considering the reasons why the Italian workers were so frustrated. When the strikes were settled, many Italian workers were not allowed to return to their jobs. Despite facing these harsh conditions, many Italian workers moved to large Canadian cities like Toronto and Montreal. They helped build the Italian-Canadian communities that still exist today. Italian settlers gradually opened businesses such as restaurants, grocery stores, and barbershops. And Toronto's Little Italy, which you see in this picture, is one of the largest Italian communities in North America today. In the early 1900s, Canada's garment or clothing industry employed many Jewish immigrants. When they tried to get jobs outside of the industry, many faced anti-Semitism. Having large numbers of Jewish workers in the garment industry was helpful, as Jewish leaders could create their own unions, which would help the Jewish workers maintain their culture. And in this picture, you see the Canadian branch of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Despite the presence of unions, Jewish garment workers still faced challenges such as low wages and unsafe working conditions. Toronto's Timothy Eaton Company was one of the most powerful employers in Canada. In 1912, male sewing machine operators were told that they would have the added task of sewing in coat linings, but would not be paid for this added task. Female workers who had performed this task would lose their jobs. In protest, the 65 machine operators went on strike. The number of striking union workers grew to 1,200 as Eaton factory workers from both the Toronto and Montreal factories joined the strike. Just take a look at this picture on the left. What kind of message do you think these Timothy Eaton garment workers were trying to convey by striking? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response. And moving on. By mid-April, the strike pay given to striking workers by the union was running out. There was very little support given by the media and among business people. The striking workers eventually gave up. However, the Eaton Company refused to hire back more than a handful of its Jewish workers. Though the Jewish workers failed to improve their working conditions, they did raise public awareness about sweatshops. Many of the striking Jewish workers would go on to become union leaders. Here's a picture of Timothy Eaton here. He was so spiteful, he said that he would rather shut down his factories than rehire the striking workers. Okay, so let's finish off today's video by considering these two questions. Number one, what does the development of ethnic organizations such as the Chinese Canadian Club tell us about Canada's attitudes toward minority groups in the late 1800s and early 1900s? And question number two, what were some of the consequences of the lack of employment opportunities for minority groups in Canada during the late 1800s and early 1900s? As always, when I finish speaking, you will put this video on pause so that you can write down your response to these two questions. If you don't feel prepared to answer either or of these questions, means you need to go back and watch this video again at least once more. And then when you're ready, please put the video on pause. And as always, I look forward to hearing your responses to these two questions as well as the other questions posted throughout this recording. But until we meet again, this concludes today's video.